The class is not recording. Please do remind me. All right. So yeah. So basically, this course is going to be an introduction to the principles and algorithms behind data compression. You've seen at least you must have got a flavor of this in your information sciences or information theory course. But in this particular course, we'll explore the algorithms involved in data compression in more detail. So you've already seen that the minimum rate of compression of any stationary and ergodic source is equal to the entropy rate. And now we'll see how do we actually achieve that rate. Can we design efficient algorithms, both practical and optimal in terms of rate? We'll see that there are different algorithms, and there are certain applications where you would use one algorithm over the other. So all classes, of course, will be online, and we'll use Google Meet for classes. We'll also use Piazza. So some of you have already used Piazza and they're familiar with it. This is basically just a forum for discussions. And I do encourage you to post questions and then have discussions here on Piazza as well, because it's a good place to sort of ask questions and discuss, since of course we can't meet each other personally. So assignment submissions and homeworks, all of these will be on Google Classroom, and I've already sent you links for both Piazza and Google Classroom. In case you haven't received either of them, just send me an email. And so the prerequisites of this course are the following. I assume that you've taken either information sciences or the information theory course. Here are some. So on Piazza, there's a post where all the video lectures of the latest edition of information sciences, information theory are put up, so you can use these to refresh what you've already learned. So for people who took this course last year in 2020, it's almost the same. Perhaps there was just minor modifications in the presentation. Certain topics were covered additionally, but as long as you're at least comfortable with the second chapter of Core and Thomas, you should be good to go. So I'll assume that you all know what entropy is, what mutual information is, what conditional entropy is, what KL divergence is, and the basic properties of these. I'd also assume that you know like Farnose inequality. And yeah, so that is basically all that we will need for this particular course. So of course, without saying it goes that you should be fully comfortable with probability and random processes, because this course, just as in information theory and information sciences, this will build up on your basics on probability and random processes. And of course, you should be able to program in one of these languages, either Python or C or C++. There will be programming assignments. So the assessment, broadly speaking, will be the following. So again, since it's online, we can't really have proper exams. And so instead of exams, we'll have a final paper presentation or a demo. So in addition to solving assignments and quizzes, you're expected to read up on a particular paper. I'll give more details about this in maybe a week or so. So you can form groups of, you can either do it individually or perhaps form a group of 2. I don't want larger groups, because then you don't really end up distributing much work. So you're expected to pick up a recent paper on data compression or learn up some practical algorithms on data compression and present this at the end of the course. So classes, of course, they'll be mostly live, but there'll also be some video lectures which will be recorded just to make up for the parts the topics which can't be covered in class. I expect the class to be as interactive as possible. So you are encouraged, you should ask a lot of questions in class. There will be in-class quizzes. These will be like very short multiple choice questions or just single word or single number entry kind of things. This will take just maybe 2 to 5 minutes each. And there'll be homework assignments. Maybe there'll be one or perhaps two homework assignments. And additionally, there'll be this paper or demo presentation. Again, this is slightly subject to change, but at a very high level, this is how grading will be done. Your attendance and class participation will cover 10%. So I'll also make note of who's participating in class. It's not a very big class, so it's easier for me to keep track of things. And quizzes will take, in-class quizzes will be around 10%. Homeworks will be roughly 50%. And the final paper presentation or demo will carry 30% of the grade. So of course, we'll follow the regular slot A. Since the timetable is fixed and there's not much flexibility, we can't really change the slot. And yeah, as I mentioned, we'll be using Google Classroom for classes. And quizzes will be typically in the regular classes themselves. The main textbook for this course is this book by Cover and Thomas. It's titled Elements of Information Theory. We followed this in the Information Theory, Information Sciences course. Hopefully you all have access to a PDF copy of this book. And if necessary, I'll post additional lecture notes or slides. So the broad syllabus of the course, all of this is available here, along with roughly like which topic corresponds to which chapter in the Elements of Information Theory book. Okay, so any questions? Any questions regarding the logistics or yeah, anything else related to the course? So is there anyone here who hasn't taken the information theory or information sciences course? Okay, so there is someone who hasn't. So yeah, it will be difficult if you haven't taken this, because I won't be covering those topics once again. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen again. Yeah, so in case you have any questions during the class, just unmute yourselves and ask. I also monitor the chat box, but sometimes I don't. So yeah, so just feel free to stop me at any point. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of what we've seen about data compression. So the basic problem of data compression is to design algorithms in order to save space. So we're given So think of it, we have, let's say, a text file and maybe a 1 MB or 1 GB text file. And in order to save space, we want to really compress this. You've seen compression algorithms in practice. So for example, your zip or rar, 7-zip, all of these are compression algorithms which work very well for text kind of data. And for images, we have the JPEG standards. So JPEG is a file format, but it's also a compression algorithm. And for video or audio, you have the MPEG class of formats. You have MP4 or MP3. So can someone perhaps tell me what is the difference between, say, zip rar 7Z and these formats? So all of them basically do compression for different kinds of data, of course, but fundamentally there's a difference between what zip rar or 7zip does, because you can also use zip or rar or 7zip to compress images. JPEG also compresses images, but there's a fundamental difference in principle between these two classes of compression algorithms. Can someone tell me what that is?
Maybe it has something to do with lossy and lossless compression.
Exactly. So while zip, rar, or 7-zip, all of these are what are called lossless compression algorithms. If I take an image or if I take a text file and I zip it, when I unzip the file, I get back the original file. There's absolutely no difference between the original file and what I get after compression and decompression, right? But on the other hand, JPEG is actually a lossy compression algorithm. If you take say a raw image and then run JPEG on this, you get something which doesn't contain all the information that was there in the original raw file. Typically, so one way we see this visually is that the resolution of a JPEG file is different from the resolution that a raw file can contain. And of course, these are good for certain applications, because for images, even though the resolution of an image is slightly bad, it's okay, because we can sort of trade off the file size and the resolution, and in certain applications that's perfectly fine. So for example, if you have an image on your phone and then you try to share it on Instagram or WhatsApp, you'll see that the resolution of the image on Instagram or WhatsApp is lower than the image that is there in your phone. And also the file size of the WhatsApp or Instagram image is typically lower than the one in your phone. And this is because internally, when you're going to share, there are certain lossy compression algorithms which reduce the resolution of the image, but also reduce the file size. So this is okay for image or video or audio formats, but then if it's a text file, then you can't really tolerate any loss. So for example, if you have a Word document, and if you say run a lossy compression algorithm, then you may just lose out some of the words or some of the characters, and that is not acceptable. So again, broadly speaking, our goal is to design these compression algorithms, lossy or lossless, and in some cases, the algorithm that you want to use will depend on your application. Okay. But even before that, so let's first start with the basic problem of data compression. So the basic problem of data compression is the following. We have a raw file, which we call the source. And our goal in order to save space, so this source could be a text file, it could be an image, it could be a video, it could be audio, and we want to compress this. So in order to save space, we run an algorithm called a compressor. It's sometimes called an encoder. An encoder is a very broad term, but a compressor is more specific. So we get a binary file after running this compression algorithm. This is called the compressed file, and typically the compressed file takes much less space than the raw file. And of course, so we want to get back the raw file or some version of the raw file. So we run an algorithm called a decompression algorithm. This is also called a decoder. And we get another file, which is a reconstructed file. So if it's a lossless compression algorithm, then we expect that the reconstructed file is exactly the same as the raw file. If it's a lossy compression algorithm like JPEG, then the reconstructed file is different from the source, right? So typically, so if it's image compression, then you have this raw file, and then you get the compressed file, which is actually stored on disk. And then you need a viewer in order to sort of read an original, to get back the original file from the compressed file. Okay. So mathematically, this is a description of a block diagram of the data compression problem. So we'll model the source sequence of the raw file as a sequence of n symbols. Okay, so it's x1, x2 up to xn. So we'll use a very abstract model of the problem. So for us, the source file is just a sequence of symbols. We don't really care about the meaning behind what is there in the file. So for example, if it's a text file, the compression and decompression algorithms will not really care about what exactly the sentences mean or what the words mean. For us, it is just a sequence of characters. It's a sequence of either English characters, or it's a sequence of ASCII characters, or you can also treat it as a sequence of words or a sequence of sentences. So irrespective of what that is, it's a sequence of symbols, and each symbol comes from some finite set, sometimes infinite. So we'll call the set from which each xi comes as the alphabet. Right? And this alphabet, in the case of if we are compressing text files, then the alphabet could be, say, a sequence. So the alphabet could be the set of all ASCII characters, or you could also, if it's a sequence of English sentences, then the alphabet would be all possible sentences in the English language. If it is, say, an image, then you can say that you can treat an image as a sequence of RGB values. So the alphabet would be set of all possible RGB values that it can take, and so on. So for each application, the alphabet is going to be different, but we will try to design these compression and decompression algorithms which work on all kinds of alphabets. Okay, but now if everything is arbitrary, then it's hard to design compression or decompression algorithms. So we'll need to make some assumptions on what the source is. The source is not going to be completely arbitrary. So for example, if you're talking about, say, English text files, then it's not an arbitrary sequence of ASCII characters or an arbitrary sequence of words, right? There is, although we don't really care about the meaning, there is still some kind of a structure behind the English language. So we'll model this using what we call the source statistics. We will assume that the sequence, the source file, is a sequence of characters which is random. And it is random and distributed according to some distribution Pxn. All right, so the source for us, or the raw file for us, is going to be a sequence of n characters which are jointly distributed according to some distribution Pxn. And for most part of this course, we'll assume that this distribution is given to us. We'll assume that this distribution is known both to the compression algorithm and the decompression algorithm. So the compression problem is to take this raw file and then output a compressed file. So the input is a sequence of n symbols. The compressed file is going to be a sequence of k bits. And our goal is to keep k as small as possible. Okay, but we also want to be able to reconstruct the original file. So in addition to designing the compression algorithm, we also have to construct a decompression algorithm, which will take as input the compressed file and output an estimate of the source file. Okay, so we are given xn, which is going to be a raw file, sequence of n characters, and the compressor takes the sequence of n characters as input. We assume that the compressor knows the statistics Pxn, and the compressor outputs a code word or the compressed file, which is a sequence of k bits. The decompressor takes the compressed file as input and outputs xn hat, which is going to be some faithful representation of the source file. Okay. Any questions at this point? Yeah, so please do ask questions in class. Okay. All right. So although, okay. Yeah, so we'll assume that both the compression and the decompression algorithms have access to the statistics of the file, so it knows the joint distribution. And even if the joint distribution is not exactly known, you can still estimate it. So for example, you can compute the empirical frequency of the letters in the file and then store it as the header in the compressed file, so that the decompressor also has access to this. So this is an easy way of designing the compressor. So that's an easy way of ensuring that both the compressor and the decompressor know the statistics. But of course, in practice, so the statistics are not the same as the true statistics. So really, in practice, you only have a px hat, right? But anyway, so that's not particularly important at this point. But yeah, what is important to note is that we assume that the distribution is known both to the compressor and the decompressor. We'll make another assumption. So it's not too unreasonable to expect that both the compressor and the decompressor know the statistics. But one assumption that we will make is that the xn, the source file, is a sequence of IID characters. Okay, so each xi is independent of all the other xi, or all the other xjs, and they're all identically distributed. So that we only have to take care of Px. So the IID distributed according to some known distribution Px. So of course, in practice, we don't really, so English text is certainly not IID. Neither are images. The pixels are not independent of each other. There is obviously a lot of correlation, but we'll see that the techniques that we develop for IID sources can be very easily used, and this can be extended to sources where there is a certain amount of correlation. So typically we will assume that the files that we're dealing with, so we're always assuming that the input is random and the joint distribution is known. The sort of general assumption that we will make about this is that the sequence x1, x2 up to xn is actually in addition. So it's either it's either independent and identically distributed, or the best that we can handle using the techniques in this particular course is that xn is stationary and ergodic. And this is something that is that's a reasonable assumption. It's a good model for things like text or images or audio or video. So if you've already taken a course on say signal processing or statistical signal processing, you will see that things like text or images or audio or video can be described by either a Markov model or a hidden Markov model or some kind of random process, which is stationary and ergodic. But if you look at sort of modern kinds of data, so for example, if you want to compress a DNA sequence, or you want to compress a very large database, or you want to compress all the details of a social network, these kinds of sources are not stationary and ergodic anymore. And what happens is that the kinds of algorithms that we will see in this particular course don't really work well. So that requires an entire different set of techniques, and new algorithms need to be developed. And these are still open questions that people are still working on. But for the most part, in this particular course, we'll be looking at what I call traditional data compression, where we assume that the source or the raw file is a stationary and ergodic sequence. So the techniques that we develop in this course can cover compression of stationary and ergodic sources, but for more complicated kind of sources, these are not optimal. Right. So any questions? Mm-hmm.
How does knowing the probability distribution help us in compressing and decompressing?
Okay, so how does knowing the probability help compressing and decompressing? So we'll maybe explore that in just a little minute, in a moment, because I've not really defined what exactly it is that we want to minimize or what the problem is. Okay, so just hold on to that question for maybe 5 minutes. Any other questions?
Sure. All the different compression algorithms we have seen for video and audio, do they also take into account the distribution? Like, do we have to tweak an algorithm according to the distribution?
So, okay, that's a very good question. So it turns out that so for certain algorithms, yes, it is necessary, and of course, so what you do is that you don't really know the distribution of the source. What you do is you try to estimate the distribution, and as I mentioned, you can do this by just computing the empirical frequency of the file, find the number of say the number of A's, the number of B's, the number of C's, and so on, and then use that as a proxy for the actual distribution. But there are also certain compression algorithms where you don't need to know the source, the distribution of the source. They work the same irrespective. So you can think of a compression algorithm as taking two inputs, the source file and the distribution. And if you change the either xn or pxn, you get a different compressed file. So even if the xn is the same and you change pxn, if I give something a qxn instead of a pxn over here, the output of the compressor is going to be different. But there are also certain compression algorithms which don't take this as input at all. They just take the raw file as input and still somehow give the same CK as output. And implicitly, what the compressor, what these kinds of compressors are internally doing is that they're also, in addition to compressing, they're also trying to learn the distribution of the source in some weird fashion.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay.
Excuse me, so if
Yes,
we
sir.
can perform the compression without knowing the distribution of the data, why not always go for that? Because knowing the distribution would add another responsibility, right?
That's a good question, but what happens is that although these compression algorithms don't need to know the distribution, they try, as I mentioned, they try to learn the distribution, and at least for certain applications, and it is not good enough. So the rate, the compression rate that they can achieve is typically lower than those which know the distribution. Because if you know the distribution, obviously you have more information, and therefore you can try to compress better. And it turns out that for very small, for reasonably small file sizes, compression algorithms which know the distribution, which take as input a pxn, tend to perform better than those which don't need pxn as input.
Okay, thank you, sir.
All right. So ultimately the question is, okay, so the problem, of course, is now to construct these algorithms, the compressor F and the decompressor G. So the compressor is, mathematically speaking, the compressor is basically a function which takes n symbols as input and outputs k symbols, right? And the decompression algorithm is something which is basically another function. Okay, so I should be a little more careful over here. It takes two things so the compressor takes two things as input: the source sequence xn, and the distribution pxn, right? And the decompression algorithm takes as input the compressed file and the distribution as input, and outputs the raw and outputs an estimate of the raw file. Correct. And our goal is to ensure that k over n is as small as possible. Correct. So as I mentioned, there are two kinds of compression that is possible. You can either do lossy compression or you can do lossless compression. So let's look at lossless compression first, and see what we can get. Okay, so in lossless compression, we want to ensure that that xn hat, the reconstruction, is the same as xn, right? So we want to ensure that xn hat is exactly equal to xn. we have xn, ck, and xn hat. Correct? So now, and I want to make sure that k over n is as small as possible. So what would be a good, so here what I allow is that k can also depend on xn, right? The size of the compressed file can depend on three things. The size of the input file. It can of course depend on the statistics, but I'll also allow it to depend on the realization of the input file itself. Any idea why I would want to do that? So for example, why can't I keep k fixed irrespective of what xn is? I'll output the same a file of the always the same size. So if I have 100-byte source file, no matter which 100 text file I give as input, it always outputs a compressed file of size 50 bytes. Is this possible? Is it possible to design a lossless compression algorithm which takes any text file of size 100 bytes and outputs a compressed file of 50 bytes?
No, sir, it's not possible.
And why is it not possible?
Sir, it will be compressed up to the entropy of that source file. So if entropy is at maximum, then
Sure. So let's say that the entropy is very small. It is 0.1 or something like that. 0.01. Okay. Yes. Any other answers? I see that, yeah, many people are saying it is not possible, but why do you think it is not possible?
So as mentioned earlier, it depends upon the structure of the file.
Okay.
Like
So
for
I'm saying
example,
it takes so irrespective of what the file is, for every 100-byte input file, it always outputs a file of size 50 bytes. Why is it not possible? Okay, so first question, how many possible input files can we have? So what is the total number of possible input files in this case?
2 power 800.
2 power?
800.
So it's 2 power 800. So 2 power 8 is the number of bytes, and raised to 100 is the total number of possible raw files. But how many possible compressed files can we have if the compressed file is to be of size 50 bytes?
Two power 400.
Okay, it's 2 power 400, right? 2 power 8 whole to the 50, which is 2 to the 400. So if we want a perfectly lossless compression algorithm, we know that basically a compression algorithm is a function. So it must mean that there exists at least one compressed file, which are, or there are at least two raw files which are mapped to the same compressed file. Correct? So since the number of raw files is larger than the number of possible compressed files, at least two raw files should be compressed to the same compressed file. Correct? So the decompression algorithm only sees this as input. Correct? And now it doesn't really know whether to output file 1 or file 2. Right? So if k is strictly less than n for all possible files, then certainly it must mean that there'll be at least one file which is in error. Okay? So we cannot really have perfect reconstruction. So xn hat cannot always be equal to xn, and there will always be some error in reconstruction. Right? Any questions?
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, this means that the size of the compressed file might be same, but it does not mean that the compressed file itself will be same, right?
So can you please repeat the size of?
So like you're saying that F1 and F2 are mapped to the same compressed file.
Correct.
So it might there might be a case that the size of the compressed file, let's say F1, the compressed file of F1 and the compressed file of F2 have the same size, but the file themselves may not be the same.
No, I'm saying that there are some two raw files for which the compressed file is exactly the same. Right? So if for each raw file, so how many raw files do I have? I have 2 to the 800 possible raw files, right? And the compression algorithm is deterministic. So is it possible that for each 2 to the 800 raw files, I get different compressed files? Can that happen?
Oh no, sorry.
No, right? So clearly there are some two files. I don't care which ones they are. There are two raw files which get compressed to the same compressed file, not just the size, but also the same sequence of bits.
Yes, sir. Got it.
Correct, right? So certainly one of them. So when decompressing, at least one of them is going to be in error. So the only way I can achieve compression is by assigning different lengths, different compressed lengths to different files. So for some files, I'll have very small compressed lengths. For some files, I'll have slightly larger compressed lengths. Correct? So I can't ensure that k over n is small for every file. But so what we will want to do is that the expected length, since k depends on xn, the size of the compressed file is also a random variable. Do you agree? So if k is allowed to depend on xn, then k is also a random variable since xn is a random variable. So the compressed length is a random variable, And so our goal will be to ensure that, of course, xn hat is equal to xn. And we want to make sure that the expected length px xn is as small as possible. Okay, so it's okay to assign maybe larger compressed lengths for certain files, but at least on average, the compressed size should be small. Okay, any questions?
Sure. We do not give the distribution directly to the compressor or decompressor, right? Like, suppose we are giving the distribution as an input. How does, let's say there are two people, one compressed it and sent it, and the other decompresses it. How does
Yes.
the other person know the px? Do they send it in uncompressed form?
That's again a good question. So typically in practice, what you would do is that the compressed file consists of two parts. Yeah. So the compressed file would consist of two parts: a header. So this contains usually metadata and that kind of stuff. But in addition, it would maybe you could store the distribution itself in quantized form. So the header contains px, and the rest is the compressed sequence itself. Right? So the decompressor first reads the header. Now it knows px, it knows which px to use, and then it uses the compression algorithm corresponding to that particular px. So again, as I mentioned, this is one implementation of it. It doesn't necessarily have to be in this particular form, and you can use different encodings for px depending on which compression decompression algorithm you're using. But as I mentioned, there are also certain compression algorithms which don't take px as input, right? And for those, you don't need to store anything extra.
Yes, thank you. And sir, just to confirm, when you're comparing compressions, we exclude metadata, right? We do not include it.
Yeah. So we'll sort of, for now, we'll assume that px we don't really count the metadata, but at least for large file sizes, it turns out that the number of bits that the metadata contains is too small, and we can just safely ignore that part.
Thank you.
So exactly. So we will assume that px is known both at the input and the output, and typically what we are interested in more than just the compressed length is to minimize the rate. So we want to ensure that expected value of k, which is a function of n px xn divided by n is small. And we'll be interested in the regime where n tends to infinity. So for really large file sizes. And for these large file sizes, the additional header information which is used to store px will be something which is sublinear in n. So this plus some h of n. Anyway, when you divide this by n, h of n by n will tend to 0 as n tends to infinity. So we can sort of exclude that part. But really, if we are interested in designing algorithms which minimize the compressed size itself, then we can't ignore this file size over here. Okay. So in fact, we'll see a particular example of that in just a moment. Okay, so since we are allowed to assign different file sizes, different compressed file sizes for different files, how do you think the compression, the size of the compressed length should depend on the sequences themselves? So if you want to design a good compression algorithm, then what can you say about k as a function of xn? So for what kind of sequences should have larger k, and what kind of files should have smaller k?
The most commonly occurring sequence would be allotted the smallest size, and the rarest one would have the largest byte allotted to it, the largest sequence allotted to it.
Exactly. So the compressed file size k should in some sense be proportional to, well, not directly proportional to, but it should somehow increase with p of xn, right? So the higher the probability of the sequence, it should be inversely proportional to the file size. So the larger the probability of the sequence, the smaller the file size that you should allow. Right? So if you think about it, if you want to minimize the expected file size, then what would be the optimal compression algorithm? Okay, can one of you think about that? So we know that sequences of higher probability should be assigned smaller compressed lengths. So now can you think of what would be the best possible compression algorithm? Or can you give me any compression algorithm at all?
So Hoffman encoding.
Huffman encoding, sure, but okay, so even without that, we haven't really seen what Huffman encoding is yet. But in fact, Huffman encoding is optimal in some sense, but there's even more sort of optimal compression algorithm in a slightly different sense.
Sir,
Yes.
please explain why it is inversely proportional to the distribution.
Okay. So again, so this is I'm saying inversely proportional in a very loose sense. All I want to say is that if the probability is large, then the compressed file size should be small. So it's not 1 over p of xn.
I'm asking why, sir.
Oh, why? So what do we want to minimize?
The final size of the compressed file.
Okay, so we want to minimize the expected file size, right? We want to minimize expected value of k of xn, which is I p of xi times length of k of xn, right? So let's take the example of, let's say that there are only two possible sequences which are possible. Okay, so maybe the all zeros sequence and the all ones sequence. Okay, and the all zero sequence has probability say 3/4, and the all one sequence occurs with probability, well maybe, yeah, so two sequences is maybe not a good idea. Let's say there are three sequences and 0 1 0 1 1. Okay, so the all zero sequence occurs with probability 3/4. The all one sequence occurs with probability 1/8, and 0 1 0 1 occurs with probability 1/8. Okay, so how many, so what would be one assignment of code words for these three sequences? Can anyone suggest a compression algorithm for only these three sequences?
0 0 for all zero code.
Okay, so 0 0 for the all zeros code word.
and 1 1 for all one code.
Okay, and for the third
And
sequence,
0 1 for the third one.
0 1 for the third one. Okay, it's a valid compression algorithm. Now, what is the expected compression length? It is 2, right? It's the same sense, it's the same.
Yes.
So expected compression length is the same. Now, but I'm not happy with this because I want to make the expected file size even smaller. Any
Sir,
suggestion?
You
sir,
can reduce the number of
only
zeros to
zero.
1.
Sorry, one at a time, please.
Sir,
You can
only
reduce
one.
the sorry.
Yes.
Sir, you can reduce the number of zeros to 1
Correct.
and number of ones to 1 in the first two cases.
Correct. So this is one compression algorithm where the all zero sequence is assigned a code word 0, all one sequence is assigned a code word of 1, and the other sequence is assigned code word 0 1. So this obviously has a smaller compressed file size, right? The expected length is now smaller. Now, if I do change this, right? Now, what can you say about the expected file size? Is it smaller or larger?
It will be larger, sir, since occurrence of first is very often, very common. So
Yeah,
that will be occur most and size will be increased.
right. So if you assign code words of smaller size to more frequently occurring sequences, then the expected file size will go down. Do you agree, Krishna?
Yes, sir, I understood.
Any other questions? Okay, so let's continue the discussion in the next class. If you have any questions, you can ask now, but otherwise we'll end the class for today. So yes, as Girish points out, yeah, you need to know the frequency of occurrence of each raw file. So that is why we're assuming that the distribution of the raw file or the distribution of the source is known.
Sir,
Yes, Karthik.
sir, programming
Krishna.
assignments part of the homeworks.
Yes, there will be programming assignments.
And how many programming assignments can we expect, sir?
Well, so there'll be a total of 2 assignments. So there'll be some programming questions, there'll be some theory questions.
Okay, sir.